The Torah reading this week is Parshat Vayetze, and it begins with our forefather Yaakov, with Jacob running for his life to escape the scheme of his brother Esav, ready to kill him. And it ends with him returning back 20 years later, back home, toward the direction of home, to be reunited with his father, with his 4 wives, and with 11 of his 12 sons and his daughter. So quite a lot happens. And as we mentioned before, these are fundamental, foundational moments in the development of the Jewish people as the nation of Hashem. Because we need to have 3 generations, 3 continuing generations to establish something with permanence. So we had the generation of Abraham and Sarah, which brought the threads of spirituality together. We had the generation of Isaac and Rebekah, creating the second link. And now we have the third threads, which is going to be our forefather Jacob. And we're going to count on his 2 primary wives, although he ends up having children with 4 wives, 6 with his wife Leah, and 2 each with his wife Rachel, Zilpah, and Bilhah, their maidservants. That becomes the 3rd generation, and already the strands are in place where we have the forefathers, the Avot and the Imot of the Jewish people in place. And the title of this class is Mixed Marriage. And I'll share a vignette first and foremost. Years ago, I was in the preschool, and I was watching a teacher present the weekly Torah reading to very, very young children probably 2.5 years old. And she was using little figures. And she was explaining to the children, this is our Yaakov, Jacob, the son of Yitzchak, the grandson of Abraham. And these are his 4 wives. And she had 4 little figures that went with that. And right away, one of the very, very young children looked the teacher in the face and said, 4 wives? And I thought it was a showstopper, because I was really interested in seeing how this teacher was going to explain to these 2-year-olds what the setup was in the household of our forefather Jacob. That being as it is, the title of this class is Mixed Marriage, because what we're going to see here is how reflective the matriarchs of the Jewish people are, and how they're in tune with the patriarchs of the Jewish people. We mentioned last week, and I would recommend you listen to that class afterwards if you didn't hear it yet, that Jacob's job and role was to be inward facing. He was this dweller in tents, the intense student of Torah and spirituality. And his twin brother Esav was meant to be the outward-facing defender who could conquer evil, who could vanquish opposition and protect the Jewish people from without. And of course, Esav failed or gave up his role as part and parcel of the Jewish people. And ultimately, we explained that in selling the right of the firstborn, or in Jacob purchasing the right of the firstborn, Jacob ends up taking upon himself a dual role. In a certain sense, he became the patriarch when there was meant to be co-patriarchs of the Jewish people. So now we're going to continue. Jacob, as we mentioned, flees for his life. He leaves the secure household of his parents that he was born into, and that he spent his entire life in study and in prayer and communion and spirituality and fulfillment of mitzvot, all on the positive, protected side. And now he's out in the world seeking his fortune. He heads out towards the house of his mother to meet up with his mother's brother, Lavan. And he's doing so to protect himself and also to secure a wife for himself. And as he heads out, he has the famous dream. I don't want to leave that out. With the ladder going up to the heavens, God reassures him. he arrives in that very same place of Haran where Abraham's servant found Rivka by the well. He arrives back at the same well, and he meets Rachel, and he immediately is struck by her. He kisses her, and then the Torah goes on, and the Torah describes the two sisters. I'm going to pick up the narrative in chapter 29, and it's sentence 17. Can be found in the Stone Chumash on page 150, 151, if you want to look at it. The Torah makes an interesting observation here. In the middle of a dialogue, the Torah says, Lavan had two daughters. The name of the older one was Leah, and the name of the younger one was Rachel. Leah's eyes were tender, while Rachel was beautiful of form and beautiful of appearance. And immediately, Jacob proposes a deal to his future father-in-law Lavan and says, I'll work for you for 7 years in order that I could marry your daughter Rachel. And he does so. And we know, as the story goes, that in the midst of the wedding ceremony, Leah, the older one, is switched for Rachel. And lo and behold, as the Torah says, when he wakes up in the morning, after getting married, behold, his wife was Leah and not Rachel. And that was the deception. They arrive at the conclusion is that he'll, after 7 days of rejoicing with his marriage with Leah, Jacob marries Rachel, the intended wife, and so he begins his marriage life with 2 wives. Now, I want to stop and look at the sentence that describes the 2 women, because we know that Sarah is described earlier in the Torah as being particularly beautiful. But there's a principle in general in the Torah, which is that the Torah doesn't use derogatory language when describing anyone. And in fact, later on in the Torah, when it refers to an animal not being impure, it says an animal that's not pure. It doesn't use the word impure. And I do want to say up front that this class is based on a presentation made years ago by Rebbetzin Leah Cohn of the Jewish Renaissance Center. She organized these sources, and I think there's very inspiring points here. And so I'm piggybacking on her presentation in this whole discussion. And I thank her. Now, what does it mean that Leah's eyes were tender? And Rashi says very famously that her eyes were worn out of crying, that she was a person who had cried her heart out, so to speak. And when you looked at her, you could see that that was the case. And then Rashi goes on to explain, quoting a medrash, which is very famous, and it says that people would say that, oh, look at this, Isaac and Rebekah have 2 boys. The oldest is Esau, and the younger is Jacob. And Lavan, lo and behold, has 2 daughters. The oldest is Leah, and the youngest is Rachel. So, as Jewish people sometimes say, it sounds like a perfect shidduch. Let Leah marry Esau, and let Jacob marry Rachel, and they'll live happily ever after. And Rashi, in fact, quotes this medrash as explaining why Leah's eyes were her salient feature, because she'd been crying over the prospect of being married to Esau, who we know ended up being an opponent, a person who abandoned his place in building the Jewish people and rather pursued worldly gain and conquest and power and prestige and might in the world, instead of undertaking to continue on the legacy of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So on its face, this seems like a very simple medrash to understand. People said Leah was worried that she would end up married to an evil person. She cried, she prayed. The medrash associates her crying with prayer. And that's the way she looked the way she did, whereas Rachel maintained her beauty, because after all, she was looking forward to being married to the righteous Jacob and being a matriarch of the Jewish people, just as Sarah before her and Rivka after that. Now, the Shem Mishmuel, a Hasidic rabbi, clarifies and says, first of all, the Torah does not talk about appearance for appearance sake. And we'll understand a little bit more why it describes Rachel as being particularly beautiful here. It even describes Jacob as kissing her when he meets her. That being the case, what is the Torah calling attention to? And then he asks another question. He says, we're talking about adult women here. We're talking about Leah, who's an adult. If she did not want to marry Esav, the Torah assumes from the beginning of the Torah to the end that women choose and agree to any marriage they enter into. And all Leah had to do was say, no, I'm not going to marry him. So what's this idea of crying and the tears and which made her eyes seem tender, which became her salient feature when you looked at her? She was a person whose appearance spoke to the idea that she'd been crying and praying and pleading with God all this time. Why did she have to do that? The Shem Mishmuel asks. She could have simply said, I'm not marrying him. Maybe if he would have lived up to his part of the bargain, as we described last week, and he would have been the outward-facing patriarch of the Jewish people, the defender of the Jewish people to the world, then of course it would be an honor to be married to him. And we even see from tradition that perhaps Esav and Leah would have been the parents of 6 of the 12 tribes, and Jacob and Rachel would have been the parents of the other 6 of the 12 tribes, because there was this concept that after 3 generations solidifying the foundation of the Jewish people, that would then branch out into 12 distinct tribes, and then that would be the contour of the Jewish people forever. So the Shem Mishmuel questions this whole idea. And then he goes on to say something very amazing, which lockstep fits into the model that we described last week in terms of the destined roles of Jacob and Esav as co-patriarchs of the Jewish people. And he says the following. He says, in general, there's always 2 sides to greatness. There's the side, as he describes, sur meira, the side of a person. Each and every one of us has this side, that I can resist evil. And then there's the side of asay tov, of being invested in doing kindness and studying Torah, in prayer, in the inner life, which builds up a person. And lo and behold, he points out that the tradition of the Jewish people is that each path of spirituality breeds its own greatness. And he refers to an analogy back to the Garden of Eden. And he says, when God created the Garden of Eden, he very famously created the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which they were prohibited to eat from. And God also created the tree of life. And he says, and this is the dual nature of the world, that there's a tree of life, study of Torah, doing kindness, fulfillment of mitzvot in a positive sense, which build a person and connect a person to God. And we associate that with developing spirituality and developing stature as a person who can have an impact on the world. But then he also points out that the mere resistance of evil, just saying no in the face of temptation, that also grows a person. I think this is a very big idea to think about. Because we think, okay, if a person was faced with a moral challenge and they walked away from it, like let's say Adam and Eve being in the Garden of Eden, had they not eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then the history of the world would have been different. Why? Because they're continuing to resist that lure, and that temptation would have made them greater and greater and greater as people. I think it's something important to know about, because a lot of times we don't give ourselves enough credit for choosing not to do something wrong. that also builds a person. So we have this idea now that Jacob and Esau were meant to be a balance. Esau gives up his role, and Jacob, in taking the blessings, first purchasing the right of the firstborn from Esau, and then later by substituting himself for his brother Esau and receiving the blessings that Isaac bestowed on him while he was pretending to be Esau. In fact, Jacob took on a dual role that he was going to become both the builder of the inner life of the Jewish people and the defender of the Jewish people on the outside. And that's what history is all about, because starting with this week's Torah reading, he's faced with continuing challenges all the way till the last 17 years of his life, when he reunited eventually with Joseph, with Joseph, and he lives in Egypt. But in the interim, all Jacob is doing is dealing with an antagonistic father-in-law in Lavan who tries to usurp the entire family. He has to confront his brother Esau face to face. He has to deal with the tensions within his own children and the sale of Joseph, the reuniting of the family. These are outward-facing, travail, high-pressure, difficult situations. And so when Jacob takes this right of the firstborn from Esau, he takes upon his shoulders a huge responsibility and a huge undertaking. Now, with this framework in mind, now this whole idea takes on different meaning. Why? Because we know there's a tradition that 40 years before a person's even created, conceived, it already is determined on high, this woman will be married to this man. And so we have an insight here that Shem Yishmuel explains to us, that Leah, by her nature, was the perfect wife for a person whose life would be confronting evil and challenge. And Rachel, on the other hand, destined, so to speak, from on high to become married to Jacob, she was the perfect wife for that inward life of building spirituality and developing ever closer association with God. So you had these two girls, two sisters. We had these two brothers. These were matches made in heaven. But then slowly and dramatically, when they turned 15 years old, Esau opted out, sold his birthright. Yes, he wanted the blessings from his father Isaac, but he didn't deserve them. And therefore their mother, Rivka, orchestrates the events, which cause Isaac to give the blessings to Jacob. So Jacob becomes the inheritor of both. In the meantime, so to speak, and this is where we pick up the narrative here, we have Leah created as the perfect match for a person whose life is going to be devoted to facing outward and dealing with challenges and overcoming evil. We have Rachel, the perfect wife for a person to nurture that inner life and to be a marriage partner with a person who lives within tents and who develops spirituality. But now we have a problem because Esau has opted out of the whole system. Leah is left with no opportunity, seemingly, to assume her rightful place as a matriarch of the Jewish people, to have a chance to be part of the upbuilding of the people destined to carry on their shoulders throughout history the mantle of spiritual leadership for the world. So what does she do? She cries. She pleads with God. She prays. She says, God, I so much want to be a part and parcel of this plan that's evolving for there to be a third generation of patriarch and matriarch to upbuild the world. And yet I see that my opportunity is lost. And she was heartbroken, seemingly left out. Now this brings us to the moment where Lavan, totally for his own reasons, and totally out of manipulation, and totally out of a way of wanting to undermine and blunt God's plans, at the last minute substitutes Leah for Rachel. And lo and behold, she does end up married to Jacob. And she is now in position to be a matriarch of the Jewish people. But let's look at the narrative here also. It's just a page later. And it's sentence 25 on page 152, 150. I'm sorry, page 150, 151 also. It says Lavan switched them. There's a whole backstory to how that took place. Vayihi baboker, and behold, it was in the morning, and behold, it was Leah. Now, this is unusual language, because obviously, if they were switched, when Jacob wakes up the next morning, his new wife is going to be Leah. But somehow the Midrash picks up on the language the Torah is using here, and it makes the following insight. Until now, she wasn't really Leah. She was someone else who we would assume is Rachel. And it was only in the morning that she reassumed her identity as Leah. What's going on here? The Midrash goes on and gives us dialogue. And this dialogue is familiar to many people because it's mentioned in Rashi. But yet it's a dialogue that really always sticks in my throat. And now, thanks to the Shem Yishmo, we'll have a whole new understanding of it. The dialogue goes like this. Lavan switches his daughters. And lo and behold, it is the elder Leah with the tender eyes under the chuppah with Jacob. He marries her. They spend the night together. Throughout that night, Leah is in fact the wife of Jacob. He wakes up in the morning and says, but you're Leah. So Jacob says, in the words of the Midrash, I'm married to you, and I see you're a deceitful person, just like your father Lavan. Your father Lavan switched you, and I see that you didn't open your mouth to say, no, I'm not who you think I am. And now it's only in the morning that I realize who you really are. So you've deceived me. And then the Medrash continues that Leah looks her new husband in the face, Jacob, and says, wait a second. Aren't you the one who had come to your father? And when he wanted to present the blessings, didn't you say, Anochi Esav b'chorecha, I'm Esav, your firstborn? Didn't you assume that identity as well? Are you really different than me? End of Medrash. Now, until now, it sounds like very unsavory behavior, especially between great people. Yeah, I make a claim against my wife. She says something sharp back to me. We both walk away in other directions. Shem Yishmo says, no, here's what's really the meaning of this. When Jacob challenged his new wife, Leah, and said, how could it be that you pretended to be someone you weren't? Leah answers him back and says, 1 second here. Are you not the Jacob who has assumed the role of an Esav, that you're also going to be an out-facing patriarch of the Jewish people, and that indeed you're going to spend the bulk of your life standing up to the onslaughts, the deceit, the trickery of Lavan, the challenge of Esav, the inner workings of a family that ends up selling a brother into slavery? That's what you signed up for. You need the tools to achieve that. And I, from my conception, I am the perfect wife for you to achieve that aim. And that's why Yaakov doesn't say anything. Because what's revealed here, and there's actually a note in the art scroll which approaches it from a different way, but sort of comes to the same conclusion. This is not happenstance here. This is not trickery. This is not having too thick of a veil or two sisters and looking too much the same or having the same voice or anything like that. What's going on here is an amazing alignment of the marital life of the third of the patriarchs of the Jewish people, Jacob, who has now taken upon himself this dual role of being both the inner-facing spiritual father of the Jewish people and also being the outer-facing defender of the Jewish people. And hence, it's absolutely the case that Leah is a necessary ezer kenegdo, a necessary helpmate, a necessary wife, a necessary partner in his life from now on, for him to be able to fulfill what he's meant to do. Go all the way back to Genesis, where God says it's not good for man to be alone. Let me fashion a partner so that the two of them together can find their way, each one complementing, rebuking, correcting, whatever words you want to use, but only the two forming one entity together can really accomplish the task in life that's before them. That's built into the nature of the world. And as we saw Yaakov, Jacob, the third patriarch, morph into a super role of taking on the job of two separate patriarchs at the same time. So we discover this week that he's going to end up married to two matriarchs, each one the perfect match, so that he can fulfill each one of these roles, each one of these responsibilities, so that he can in fact found the Jewish people on the rock solid third generation in a row of solidifying the legacy of Abraham and Sarah, the legacy of Isaac and Rebekah, and seeing to it that there can be a Jewish people that have the foundational strength to surmount all the tribulations of history and to prevail all the way until the end of human history, when everything will be resolved in clarity and the world will come to the end of days, as we refer to them. So this medrash is opening our eyes, the Shem Yishmor explains to us, and is explaining to us that just as last week we came to understand that the interplay between Jacob and Esau was not sibling rivalry, but was something totally different. It was the necessity of the Jewish people being founded with both the quality of inner spirituality and an outer facing strength and resolve and commitment that could withstand all of the challenges that history has thrown against us. And this week, lo and behold, we see how God has provided, just as he provided Eve to Adam, so too God has provided Leah and Rachel to Jacob, so that he can have the proper marital strength and union, which will equip him and enable him to fulfill this dual role. And just to continue the narrative forward, we know also that Rachel also is famous for her tears and is noted for her crying. We see that much later in the Torah. We see that all the way in chapter 48:7, when the same Jacob is explaining to Joseph, Rachel's firstborn child, why she was buried on the roadside, and why, in fact, if you go to Israel today and you go to the Machpelah cave, you'll find out that Abraham and Sarah are buried there, Isaac and Rebekah are buried there, Jacob and Leah are buried there, but Rachel is buried elsewhere. She's buried at Kever Rachel, at the grave of Rachel, which is outside of Bethlehem, just as it's described in the Torah. And you may be aware, because it was destined for that to be the case, because when the Jewish people become exiled at the destruction of the first temple, and it really seems like God is wiping us off the face of the earth, kicking us out of the promised land, dispersing us, 10 tribes dispersed seemingly for good, 2 tribes being sent down to Babylonia with a promise that they could return, that in fact it's only Rachel standing in a spiritual state right by the roadside as the Jewish people walk by on their way into exile, pleading with God. And basically her plea is to God, crying and saying, look, God, look what I did for my sister. I allowed her to be substituted for me, and I didn't act out of jealousy. I didn't act out of personal consideration. I didn't act zealously to protect my interest in being married to my beloved Jacob, but rather I stepped aside. And if I, a fragile human being, can step aside on behalf of my sister, then you, God, can surmount your anger and your zealousness and your jealousy, so to speak, of the Jewish people worshiping other gods, which is sending them into exile, and you can return them back again. And hence Rachel, through her tears, is credited with creating the opportunity for the Jewish people to return and build the second temple, which lasted for 420 years. The Jewish people are exiled again, as we are presently still in that exile. But then the promise that ultimately we can return back to the land is all because of the pleading of Rachel, of Mama Rachel, of Rachel, the matriarch of the Jewish people, because of how much she gave up on behalf of her sister, seemingly never to be married to Jacob, although she ends up married to him, seemingly to not be a matriarch of the Jewish people, although she is a co-matriarch of the Jewish people. But that's the attitude that evoked the compassion of God. And God says, yes, they will go into exile, but I will return them. And if they eventually go into exile again, I will ultimately return them back, and they will be my people. There will be a third temple. There'll be an ingathering of the exiles, and the world will indeed enjoy a final chapter of history with peace and harmony and all the visions that we know from Isaiah of bending the swords into plowshares and the lion sitting down with the lamb, that there being a sense of peace and harmony in the world, really going all the way back to evoking the peace and harmony of the world as God initially created it when he placed Adam and Eve into the Garden of Eden. What do we see here? The reason the Jewish people have survived these exiles is because the Jewish people have been able to maintain this inner life, Torah study. We're the people of the book. We're known as that wherever we are, no matter how difficult the conditions are under which we live, no matter how many pogroms or crusades or oppressions or dispersions, or how many times we have moved from one country to another. The Jewish people have clung to the spirituality, to the inner life of the Jew. And for example, Menachem Begin, as prime minister, said, don't think that it is thanks to the merit of the strength that we have that we're again rebuilding the land of Israel. No, it's the strength of the merit that we have because of the inner life of the Jewish people throughout the entire span of Jewish history. So we see here that Rachel's really doing her job when she pleads on behalf of the Jewish people as we walk down this dusty road into exile with such uncertain future, with so many tragedies, to face so many travails of history. But the secret there is that aspect of Jacob that dwells in tents, that continues to study Torah, that continues to build lives and families based on kindness and compassion and connection to one another. Everything that the Jewish people have been known for and noted for throughout history. The people that in the midst of the Warsaw Ghetto created schools and orphanages in spite of the fact that it was just a matter of waiting until the next train load was deported. But nothing stopped this inner life of teaching Torah, of studying, of showing compassion, of feeding the hungry, of acting with kindness, that always has prevailed. And of course, it was Rachel's role to preserve that and to ingrain that within the Jewish consciousness, which she did do. She's described as the Akeret Habayit, the foundation of the house of Jacob. She gave birth only to 2 of the 12 tribes. She died while giving birth to the second, to Benjamin. You could ascribe to her a minor role, but we know from the perspective of where she's buried, and that her tears and her pleas on behalf of the Jewish people are what nurtures that inner spirit that keeps us alive till today. So we see again that this inner-facing and outer-facing aspect, the fact that the Jewish people forever are going to have to surmount moral challenges within and physical challenges from without. That's just what it's all about. It also teaches us something very, very important. it teaches us that pursue good, do as much good as you can in your life, but don't ever forget the value of living in purity and saying no to temptation and avoiding living within the prohibitions of the Torah as well. It's not just avoiding corruption, but that also builds closeness to God. It's also a foundation stone for the Jewish people being able to survive throughout history. And the other aspect, of course, is when it comes to our marriages, to understand that there are roles to play. The term Ezer Kenegdo, which applies to Adam and Eve, from the get-go means that each person, each of the two people in a marriage have to understand, how do I find the strength to fulfill my destiny and my potential? And how do I also find the strength to build up the other person in the marriage and be the perfect spouse to that person so that they can become as great as they are? And that's a duality also. That's a facing in and a facing out in and of itself. And that's what great marriages are built on. It's not a matter of sacrificing for one another. It's really purely a matter of each person taking seriously that I have to guard myself and develop myself. And because I am in a marriage, and because this is what marriage is all about, I also have within me the wherewithal and the opportunity to be that Ezer, to be that helpful person, the husband to the wife and the wife to the husband, so that I can both achieve most I can in life, and I can compatibly see to it that my spouse also achieves the most. And of course, in doing so, we set the perfect example for our children, so that when they approach marriage, it's not a question of, am I getting the better deal or not? Let's keep score who's taking out the trash more often, or who's being the, to use very modern term, who's being the oppressor and who's being the oppressed here. It really is a question of how we can achieve a sense of synergy and oneness together, so that on all fronts, we can carry forward all that's precious from the generations before, and we can project to our children what it means to have a loving, caring, mutually supportive relationship where it's all for one and one for all. And ultimately, we have a conviction that if this is my marriage, then I have to do my utmost to benefit from it myself and to benefit the other as well. These are the ideas that are the bedrock of the Jewish people. This is what the Torah is unveiling to us. This is the true lesson of what otherwise seems just like a very convoluted story. But it's not a convoluted story. It's a story that reveals the inner essence of what it means to build an eternal people, a people that's capable of representing goodness to the world. We don't fulfill our opportunity and our responsibility often, but occasionally we do, and to some extent we do all the time, and we need to aspire to do better. And I have to say right now, with all of the external horrific difficulties the Jewish people are facing, the inner life of the Jewish people is blossoming in a way that's very precious to see, and in a way that really, really does confirm these deep, thoughtful, and important lessons of the Parsha. Please God, we should all take them to heart. Thank you very much.